Hi, I'm Lynn Morgan, your slipper-shod pastor, hanging out again today on the back porch with you. You know, scriptures challenge us to read them carefully, and that often means not literally. One of the passages of scripture that one could easily trip over is found right in the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20. There it says, "I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me." I want to say just as clearly as I possibly can, I do not believe in a God who punishes children for the sins of their parents. I just don't. If I believed that God really did operate that way, that God said, you know, because Lynn has been a jerk, I'm going to punish his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren and maybe his great-great-grandchildren just for good measure. If I believed that God actually made that kind of decision, that kind of judgment to punish my sinfulness, then I most assuredly would reject that God. I might have to be afraid of a God like that, but I could never love and serve a God like that. And I hope that you couldn't either. And so when I read that passage, I don't believe for a moment that that's what it envisions. A God who exercises judgment and says, bam, I'm getting your family for your faults. On the other hand, I think that passage reveals to us quite plainly that when Lynn is a jerk, and Lord knows he has been one, that has an impact on his children. And the way in which his sinful and broken behavior has raised his children with pain and deprivations that they did nothing to make themselves, that does indeed bring injury to them. And it could bring injury to the way that they raise their children, and so forth, because we all recognize the intergenerational nature of dysfunction in families. And it's not just in families, it's in society. Some of the horror that we are dealing with on the front pages of our paper this week is racism, fearfulness, distrust, division, that we didn't create necessarily, but which we can inhabit and which we can choose to regret. But it all was planted many, many generations, not just 3 or 4, but dozens of generations before we ever were thought of, where African Americans were kept as property and only very recently given anything like equal footing in society, in the law, and yet to experience full equality in the way that they are treated, in the expectations that are harbored about them. This is sinfulness. This is sin that perhaps we did not create, but it is a punishment for sin that we all live under. And it is our responsibility then to try to undo some of this, to work against it, and to recognize it as a judgment upon us, not one inflicted by God, but one which we have inflicted upon ourselves, one which our ancestors have rained down upon us, but does not have to be the last word. In our Old Testament lesson in the lectionary today, and I know I'm going a long time here, but in the Old Testament lesson today in Jeremiah, we read this very peculiar little proverb. Jeremiah says, in this day, when God's Spirit rests upon people, when they no longer learn the law by scrolls, but they have it burned into their very hearts, in that day, then they will no longer say, the parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge, but each shall die for their own sins. Jeremiah says there's coming a time when those historic injustices under which we struggle will be undone, that each person will stand or fall on the basis of their own integrity, their own actions. This echoes very clearly what we heard from Martin Luther King Jr. in his famous I Have a Dream speech, when he looked forward to the time when people would be judged on the content of their character and not the color of their skins. He got it from Jeremiah. There's coming a day when we will not be bound by the past, by the actions of our ancestors, when my children will be liberated from my own brokenness. We look forward to that day. But in the meantime, brothers and sisters, let us do all that we can, not to live out the trajectory of those historical sins, and not to add to them by our own indifference. God forbid we doom future generations to more pain, more dysfunction, more distrust, more racism, more violence, more chaos. Instead, let us sow the seeds of love and harvest God's peace.